My name is Alejandro Macias. I'm based out of Tucson, Arizona, and I'm primarily a painter, draftsman, who uses multimedia approaches. I really started to think about what kind of work I wanted to make around 2016. Even before that, I knew that I wanted to be a figure painter and use the figure as a vessel to talk about issues that were interesting to me. But I had a very difficult time figuring out what kind of aesthetic I wanted, ideas I wanted to explore. It's not until I started traveling around 2016 and I landed a residency in Vermont. That's when I met other kind of young contemporary artists that were exploring their own lived experience. And coming from Brownsville, Texas, I felt like about 95% of the population is Mexican American. And so there is a very kind of similar lived experience in Brownsville. And so I asked myself, why would I want to speak on an experience that a lot of people feel or live or on a daily basis? And so it's not until I traveled and kind of escaped my own bubble that I felt people don't know anything about what's happening on the border, outside of the border. And that's when I felt like I have something to say, and I think my words are worthy of sharing, and my own lived experience can probably be felt by other lived experiences that deal with the feeling of assimilation, acculturation, feeling with this idea of duality, dealing with the duality, and this type of existence on a daily basis. And so coming back from that, I explored a variety of techniques. I knew that I wanted to be a draftsman. I knew that I also wanted to be a painter. But I didn't know whether I wanted to go through a more traditional route, because I came from a pretty traditional conservative upbringing. And then it seemed like the Brownsville community, even within the arts, felt that skill and technical ability were the techniques that were more favored. And I didn't want to feel limited by that. And so I felt like abstraction was a much more sincere reflection of how I was feeling from within. And so I realized it clicked to me that I was dealing with this two separate approaches that I felt were intriguing to me, but I didn't know how to approach them individually. So I felt, why don't I just include both? And that's when I had this kind of eureka moment that I felt that those two ways of approaching my work were actually a reflection of how I was feeling living on the border and living this existence between two cultures and dealing with this duality and not really feeling like it belonged in either. And so sometimes when I felt like my own identity was questioned, I was constantly questioning the approaches that I would be approaching in my own work and compositions. And so this division came within my work. There was this compositional split, and times later, in times when I started to kind of refine my own approaches and concepts, then a literal cut would come in, and I would cut into the compositions. And then I got to a point where I felt even drawing and painting weren't enough. And so I felt like I was always a fan of film and the moving image and video. So I started to cut into my surfaces and then bring film and video into the work. And I wanted to have a still image and a moving image work simultaneously to kind of explore all these ideas of dealing with my life along the US-Mexico border. So my process in this particular case, I'm really interested in exploring obviously my own identity, but the whole idea of the show is based around people that have affected me, are part of my family and friends that I've known the past few years. There's one particular work that actually goes back to my grandfather, who was a migrant from Mexico. And so I've been the last few years really kind of exploring how I feel and how I have, basically felt navigating the border coming from Brownsville, South Texas to Tucson, Arizona. And I think there's even one particular time one summer where I traveled from Brownsville all the way to LA in one summer, just to kind of feel how other people felt across the US-Mexico border. And so my work is primarily figure-based, and I felt like, I think that felt like the most accessible subject that I felt people could see and possibly at least try to understand where I was coming from, or where these friends and family were coming from as well. And so at the core of a lot of the work I think about, it is about erasure, and I've had a lot of questions like, what does that mean, erasure? I think about, when I think about assimilation, I feel like part of your heritage, part of your culture is being erased, taken from you. I think about bodies literally crossing this line, and also physically being erased, disappearing. So you'll see a variety of works that have like negative space, or like silhouettes where figures are literally walking away, or placing themselves depending on the situation that they're in, or where they're crossing into. There's parts where there is compositional division as a way to mask or cover and hide, again, as a form of erasure. I think about even I think about code switching and being able to navigate two places that are very different, but able to like still fit. And so I think those are just a variety of things that I'm thinking about when I'm making the work. And although I tend to get bored a lot, and so I think that a lot of the work that I'm exploring feels different, but at the core of it, it's me kind of still talking about a lot of the same issues, and this kind of angst that I feel like abstraction can truly reflect. And so I feel like I bring a variety of media into the work that I feel is interesting to me, because I feel like I can make it exciting for myself, but still as well for the viewer. And but the later work that you see that I did this year and that I began last year is the video work. I feel that's work that I didn't want to be limited by just painting and drawing in particular. So I felt like video, that opened the door for me, that I could explore a variety of things. And some of the paintings are primarily pretty small, and a lot of it actually is rooted to an iPad my mother gave me right out of grad school in 2012. And I didn't touch the iPad for 10 years because I felt if I had a computer and an iPhone, like why would I want to use an iPad? And it's not until it clicked to me that I felt, oh, I can give this iPad a second life. I'm interested in film and video. So I made a very small painting, about 16 by 20 initially. And it was me walking Tumamoc Hill, which is this famous ecological site in Tucson, Arizona. And I started thinking about migration and the trek that migrants have to face through this brutal desert terrain. And then I started kind of broadening the ideas a little bit further than that. So there's actually a lot of these paintings include an iPad behind them and a painting that's mounted over it to kind of explore the moving image in a variety of ways. The wood one, there's actually two pieces in this work that actually use the same piece of found wood when I was walking the alleyways of Tucson, and I was intrigued by salvaging something. A lot of that is also rooted to the idea of identity, salvaging my own culture and heritage, holding on. Like even Spanish is my first language, and when I started to assimilate, I started to focus my trying to perfect the English language as a way to not feel alienated. And now later in life, I understand what that word means and what that process is like. And now I think about salvaging much of my own childhood and, my upbringing, and even trying to connect through speaking Spanish. And so I thought even about how do I use found wood and also give it a second life with something that feels refined? And again, it was kind of tied to, again, this like duality that I was like feeling. A lot of it is also rooted to my last few months in Brownsville. I would spend a lot of time in downtown Brownsville, and it was this historic place that once was, economically was booming. And I think a lot of the militarization of the border, a lot of the kind of the disconnect that was created through that people weren't able to like go back and forth as easily. So a lot of those buildings have started to deteriorate and fall apart. And so I was also like interested by like urban landscapes, things being boarded up, covered, as well, again, as I've mentioned, erased, and something of the past. And so when I was walking the alleyways, I found this like gigantic piece of wood that said "free" on it. And so like the wood that's on these works it's unaltered. There's nothing that I ever did to any of it. And so all I did was cut it. And so the first work that I ever did it with was a portrait of my grandfather. And so I was intrigued by, again, cutting a lot of my pieces. And so that has a cut that is actually the Rio Grande that separates Texas and Mexico. And so what I did, I decided to mount this piece of wood without any adjustments and to it, directly on it. And then in the bottom is a very refined portrait of my grandfather back when he was much, much younger. And then the other one, I had a lot of it still kind of that I still wanted to salvage. And so I did a self-portrait of myself. And again, I thought about this idea of being concealed and hiding in plain sight through a variety of groups, and having the ability to even do that and privilege of being able to do that. And so I cover half of my face with this piece of found wood that I felt was important enough to salvage and include in a work. So that's how I started to do that. In terms of the video, again, I felt that there was more to just drawing and painting for me. And I always wanted to be a painter and draftsman, but I didn't want to be like confined to like a particular thing. I never want to be known just for like one thing. And I want to be able to like artistically like flex. And so I started thinking about like video, like very short like segments of video that could be looped and would even like catch like viewers' attention. And so there's like videos of landscape, my own place, like along the borderlands, my place in other like spots across the nation where I felt connected to some capacity. In one particular work, there's a skyline of the 4th of July, and I felt like that was an interesting moment to experience because I had never been in a moment like that in a large city. I came from a very small town, and like the idea of being Americanized felt like very like interesting to me, and I felt like that was the perfect subject or content to explore. And then now my place in the borderlands, I feel very connected to Tucson, to the border, to the desert, and it's very difficult to see myself outside of it, despite me traveling. And then the idea of, there's a triptych called The Game in the Southwest that uses actually two basketball teams from the Southwest, which is the Phoenix Suns and the San Antonio Spurs. And I'm from Texas, which is like a dynasty of a team, and then the Phoenix Suns. And so I have these like two teams kind of like battling it out, and there's like these like kind of like pivotal highlights that I felt were important. And the triptych includes me, my friend Rigoberto Luna, and my former student and friend Jesus Trevino, who are all kind of fans of basketball. And The reason I sometimes include sports into my work is that I feel sports can connect people and communities despite their religious backgrounds, their different cultures, different beliefs, and despite even like race, people come together, but still feel diehard about where they're from and the culture that they're from. And so they use this like team as a way to kind of represent that. And so aside from myself and the two people that I show in this work are diehard basketball fans. And so, but I also think about the power of sports and how I use the basketball, like how I use the game of basketball as a metaphor for even the internal angst of this going back and forth between cultures and this kind of like duality that I consistently deal with. And I don't know if there's ever any winning, but there's particular highlights in these games where one team is eliminated. There is like physical contact. There's an image of Steve Nash with a nosebleed, but continues to play. And so these are like just like ideas and highlights of like perseverance and fighting and not giving up. So I was just really intrigued by that idea of like going back and forth. And also the one thing that I forgot to mention is that everybody is of Mexican descent that I'm incorporating into these works. I felt that idea of the going back and forth, especially using a sport as a metaphor, will be consistent throughout a lot of the figures that I'm portraying here. I can touch base on why it's not just me, and that's because I didn't want it just to be about me. And I got to a point where I felt comfortable portraying myself, and I rely on references a lot. And so like, well, who best to use as a model than me, because I just could access my space whenever I wanted. But I started thinking about like archive photography, using references of my family when they were younger, and this kind of like generational, like even generational trauma. I felt that was interesting to me, how each generation felt much more Americanized, and whatever that term might mean, there was a difference in the way we would navigate life, depending on the generation that we're in. And then I started thinking about people outside of the border. So you do see some like figures that are included that aren't necessarily from the border, but they're from their parents like also migrated crossing the border but live elsewhere. And so they might live across the nation, but still have a desire to connect to a culture that feel that they belong to. And so I felt like these ideas of assimilation and acculturation and ideas of wanting to belong are universal. It's not just about me. And so I felt really compelled to explore other people that weren't just me. There's actually 2 works in this show that I did very recently, and the titles are actually like loosely kind of like taken from the Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands book. And Gloria Anzaldúa was a writer from the Rio Grande Valley that responded to this angst of dealing with coming from 2 cultures. And so again, I go back to this idea of not really necessarily just, covering myself through these works, but other like Chicanos and Chicanas that are, feeling disconnected or alienated. Like the Roots of the Mesquite is this particular painting that is of a figure of a woman actually that I felt could really connect to the concepts that I felt I was already kind of introducing into a lot of the works that I was already making. And I use, it was actually the only work in this show that has the setup and textile design. And I use the setup and textile design to kind of reinforce this ethnic identity, specifically Mexican. And I tend to sometimes cover or like mask a large portion of the figure through the setup and textile design. And I like the viewer to think about what is happening. Is there like some sort of transition happening? Is the figure disappearing, or is the figure becoming intact? Is the serape removing itself, or is it encompassing the figure? And so the idea of like creating form simultaneously with the flatness of the serape, I think just became not only aesthetically pleasing execution for me, but I felt like conceptually it was working, and I felt like there was this kind of another way of exploring this battle and angst that's happening within. This particular subject lives in New York and never visited the borderlands until around 2021. And she felt very connected to the borderlands and was reading Gloria Anzaldua's book. And so the title is directly rooted to that book. And I wanted to capture in this moment of reflection, thinking about her place in time along the borderlands and her place outside of it. And so that's why I felt like she was like a perfect subject for that work. I will say that like coming from South Texas, like much of my life was rooted to being there, and I moved in 2019 for a position at the University of Arizona teaching painting. And so this is like literally like, I think like 5 months before the pandemic hit. And I came to Arizona not knowing anyone, not a single soul. And so it felt very interesting to me to move to a state that I've never been in or lived in my early 30s. But I felt like I acclimated very well. And a lot of this was because the people around me made me feel welcomed. And I found a community that I felt that I could connect to. And that's when I felt like, even when I did the interview process, that I felt like I found people that I could understand and appreciate the kind of direction that I was going with artistically. And so I'm very thankful for the support that's been given to me since I arrived, especially with the pandemic hitting like soon after I arrived. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity and to be able to exhibit my work in this space.